Hey guys, how you doing? It's Rogaway here, and I am back with another tutorial. And today we are looking at 3D modeling and just 3D design in general. And I'm just going to show you really quickly what I mean by 3D modeling. If I do a quick search for 3D models, basically I'm going to get all these kind of somebody created models of various things. And what really defines a 3D model is something that is built using a polygon mesh. And as you can see, if you look at this shape over on the right hand side here, it looks like some kind of a creature or monster, but he's actually made up of these polygons. And if you are good at 3D, you can manipulate these polygons to make some really cool things. It could be, you know, characters or levels or animations or you name it. Basically, that's the goal of 3D modeling and just 3D animation or 3D design in general, is to recreate something or to create something that doesn't exist by manipulating polygons. All right, and there's a lot of ways we can do this. So let's just put this down for a sec. We're going to be using a piece of software that is totally free. It's called Blender. I recommend you download it at home. It is excellent. It's free. It's really, really good. It should be on your dock. If it's not, you can just search for it. It should be there. Otherwise, you might have to download it. So let's launch Blender. So once Blender launches, this is the latest version. You might not see this, but when this launches, I'm going to click General. And I'm going to be in the default view here, where basically I can see they put a cube down for me. It's got a few basic things. This is called a camera. It's got a simple light. This is a light. This is a camera. And there's the cube. And basically this is the starting point for my scene. And in 3D, the reason it's called 3D is because we are working in three different axes, and you can see them defined right here. The red line is the x-axis, and the y is the green line. The blue we can't see right now, but that's the z-axis. Basically, when you have those three, you can create objects that have dimension and 3D sort of characteristics. So just to kind of give you an overview of how this layout or the working space looks, this is where we are working in this view right here. This is where we're going to be building whatever it is that we're building. Up here we have our scene, and it shows us what's inside of our scene right now. You can see we got a camera, we got a cube, and we got a light. And over here we got all sorts of options we'll get into later on. We got some simple tools over on the left hand side. Down at the bottom we have our timeline, so if we're making an animation, that's where we can do that. Along the top we have all these little tabs depending on what we're doing. So for now we're just going to stay in layout mode, and we're going to just learn the basics of the program. So the very first thing you probably want to know, or how I'm going to show it, is different shortcuts for sort of moving around this working space and being able to kind of manipulate this area. So the very first thing you can do is you can use your middle mouse, your scrolly wheel in your middle of your mouse to zoom in and zoom out. By default, the scrolly wheel is set to zooming your view. Alright, you can change that if you really want, but for now we're going to keep it all default. Alright, so we can zoom in and we can zoom out on the cube, and we can get closer or farther away, depending on how we want to work on it. The other thing we can do is we can hold the middle scrolly wheel down, and that will allow us to rotate the view and to look around the cube and actually see, you know, all the sides of it. And if we're editing it or making it into a different shape, then this is very important, so we can actually, you know, look around it. The third one is to hold the Shift key and to press the middle scroll wheel, and that will allow you to move the view. Alright, so this allows us to kind of move the view wherever we want, And as we're building more complex things, we're probably going to have more things going off to the sides, and you're going to have to move your view around. Okay, so that is sort of the basics of moving and zooming and rotating the view, which is very important in order for us to get started. So just spend a couple seconds kind of just playing around with those shortcuts to get comfortable with that. Now the next thing you might want to do is work in set views, and this becomes really important, as I'm going to illustrate shortly here. Right now it tells us that we are inside of a user perspective view, which basically means we're looking down on this cube from a user point of view. It's got perspective. You can see that it's in 3D. And this is kind of the default. Anytime you change the view, this is what it's going to go to. If you look on your keyboard and you look to the far right of your keyboard, you're going to see what's called the numpad. The numpad is basically a bunch of numbers off to the right-hand side that we can use to go through our preset views. So if we press 0, for example, what it's going to actually let us do is look through the camera that's on in the scene. That becomes important later when we're rendering out our artwork, but for now, again, we're not going to worry too much about that. If we press the 1 key, it takes us to the front view. So now we are looking directly at the front of our object. If we press the 3, it takes us to the right view. If we press the 7, it takes us to the top. And if we press 9, it takes us to the bottom. Now you might be wondering, why is it important that we can switch to preset views? Well, when you're working in 3D, it's really difficult to kind of figure out where objects are going to go in a 3D window. So let's first of all, let me highlight this in a second here. I'm going to show you. First of all, if you have an object, let's say we have this cube, and probably the first thing we want to do is actually be able to move this cube and to, maybe put it with other objects. So the shortcut for moving an object is to press the G key. And I always remember because I think it stands for grab. So if you press G, you can pick this object up and you can move it around. Okay, so now I'm able to move this object wherever I want. Now let's create a scenario here where I want to take this cube and maybe I want to move it back along this red line, okay, which is my x-axis. Let's say I want to move this cube back along the x-axis. And so I just simply press G, I'm moving it around, I'm going to try to place it back there as best as I can. Let's see, to me, that looks pretty good right there. And I just click to let go of it. So I moved it by I along the x-axis. Now watch what happened. Watch what I really did. If I rotate my view, I didn't actually move that cube along the x-axis. What happened is, because I was in a perspective view, I actually moved that cube sort of in all axes. All axes. I moved it in the x and the y and the z, and it's just kind of floating up there. And so that's not what I wanted. So I'm going to just undo. I'm going to press Command Z. And now I'm going to show you how to actually move things along different axes. So there's two ways you can do this. You could go to a preset view, like let's say front, and I can move it along that way. And now I'll show you if I rotate out, it only moved along the x-axis because I was in a front view. Or, I'm just pressing Command Z to undo. Or, here's an easier way. I can press G to start grabbing the object. And then while it's moving like this, I press the X key on the keyboard. And what that does is it locks it so that it only can move along the x-axis. If I press the Y key, now it's forced to only move in the y-axis. And if I press the Z key, now it only moves in the z-axis or the z-axis. So that's an easy way of moving objects and getting them to where you want by actually forcing them to move only along those lines. It's very handy, as you'll see later on. Let's say we want to make this object bigger. Let's say we want to scale this object up and we want it to actually become bigger. Maybe we're going to have multiple blocks stacked on top of each other, and this bottom one's the biggest one. The shortcut for that is simple. It's the S key, which stands for scale. And now when we click and drag, we can make this object bigger or smaller depending on our needs. Now there is one thing that's really cool about Blender is that, and it's similar to this move tool that we just did. Let's say we want to only scale this cube in the x-axis, for example. So along the red line. So while we're scaling, just like this, we press the X key. And now it'll only scale it in the x-axis. If I press the Y key, it only scales in the y-axis. And if I press the Z key, it only scales in the z-axis. So you can see that that can really change the shape of an object depending on what you need to make, and that works pretty well. So that is scaling. The last sort of thing that we're going to want to manipulate is rotation of the object. So let's say we want to actually rotate this object in a different sort of orientation. What we can do is press the R key. And by default, it's going to just rotate in every axis. And we can just kind of guess or sort of manipulate it this way. But again, if we want to only rotate in a certain axis, we can now press X to do it just in the x-axis, do Y in that axis, or Z just to have it in that axis. All right, so that's really powerful and really useful, and it works really, really great. And so that's the basics of moving, scaling, and rotating. Really, really good stuff here. So next what we're going to do is, let's say we don't actually want a cube. Let's say we want maybe a sphere or a pyramid or some other shape instead. What you would do is, let's say I no longer want this shape. The shortcut is X, and it'll ask you, do you want to delete it? And you just hit OK, and it's gone. All right, so you now have nothing on your stage. You only have a camera and a light. And now we're going to put something else in here. So let's say we want a sphere. So we can go to Add. And in the Add menu, we have all sorts of things that we can put into our project. For now, we're going to just stick with meshes. And the meshes are also known as primitive shapes. These are shapes that are used to build other shapes, to make other objects. So let's say we want a sphere. This is called a UV sphere. I'm going to click that, and now we have a sphere in our project space. Whoops, let's undo that. I was scaling by accident. Okay, and like I said, if you ever make a mistake, you can always press Command Z and you can undo what you have done previously. Now, one last thing I want to show you guys before I wrap up with this sort of basics of Blender video. Remember what I said, that everything that is in 3D is made of polygons. We're going to talk more about this later. But up here, you have different views, different viewport shading, it's called. So if I go to wireframe, I can actually see the mesh that's creating this object. If I go to solid view, I see the solids. Later on we get into textures and rendering, which we won't talk about right now, but that will allow you to actually see the structure of the objects you're working on. All right, the shortcut for that is the Z key, and that will allow you to switch between those views quickly. So if I want to go to wireframe or solid or whatever, I can do that really quickly. All right. But basically, that is the basics of Blender getting started. We're going to go a lot more into detail on what we can do with these objects once we've added them. But for now, this will at least give you sort of the basics understanding of how Blender works. There's a lot you can do just with real simple primitives, but if you do want to get into 3D design at some point, you need to know the basics, and you need to know how to use the objects that you're placing into your scene, because that'll really form sort of the basis for the rest of the 3D stuff you do. Anyways, thanks for watching. Till next time, see you then.